Welcome back, everybody. Disappeared in the middle of the land acknowledgement as I was talking about the land, air, and water that we all share. And I guess the technology as well. Let's also acknowledge that's what's connecting us right now. Um, Wherever you are, if you're watching today, I invite you to share your location and acknowledge some of the Indigenous history or people in whatever area that you are participating from today in the chat. I always love reading it and seeing where the members are. I'll read Equity's statement of affirmation. Equity embraces an open and inclusive environment and encourages respectful behavior that affirms the dignity of all individuals. Equity further recognizes our shared responsibility for vigilance in creating and maintaining this environment. Equity recognizes a shared history with Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. In honor of those who have gone before us, Equity commits to working toward understanding and actionable practices of reconciliation. So, again, welcome to the third in a series of workshops and seminars that Equity is proud to bring to you today. They've all been on some really great topics so far about the industry at large and what's going on. Equity gratefully acknowledges the Government of Canada for funding these programs through the Department of Canadian Heritage as a part of the Canada Performing Arts Workers Resilience Fund. After the workshop, we're going to be sending you a link to a little survey, not too long, just so we can get your feedback on these workshops and guidance as we plan future ones, because we want to stay on top of what's important to the membership and what you're all interested in. As usual, if you've been to one of these before, or for the first time, if it is your first time, if you have a question, please use the raise hand option. It's down at the bottom of the of your Zoom screen there, or put your question in the Q&A section, which should be the next one over from the raised hand section. If you put your questions in the chat, they're easy for us to miss and not answer. So using raise hand or Q&A allows us to make sure we get to them. And that's enough for me. So now I'd like to introduce our instructor and our moderator for today's workshop. Alex Gravenstein is a professional on-screen performer and co-founder of the self-tape audition cold read workshop Isolation. He has worked in video editing, directing, camera work, VFX, and color, in addition to running the technical aspects of auditions for Montreal-based casting houses Canyon Wells Casting and Elite Casting. And now I will hand things over to Deena Aziz, Equity Counselor for the Quebec region for how many council terms now, Deena? 3 terms. Performer and moderator extraordinaire. Take it away, Deena.
And I'm basically going to hand the baton over to Alex. Alex has structured a really excellent session for us today, and we're going to try and interject with questions as we go. So if you have something that's related to the subject at hand, please raise your hand or put it in the Q&A, and I will try and speak those into the room. And then depending on how things go, we may have a sort of dedicated Q&A time at the end. But I think you're going to find this all really constructive and comprehensive. So Alex, over to you.
Hi. How does this work with the polls? Or
with the poll, let's. You're quite right. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
We wanted to get a sense of the room, and so we're just going to throw a quick poll up there to see how everyone here in attendance feels about self-taping, digital self-tapes at the moment. The first question is, what percentage of your auditions for live performance in the past 6 months, say, have been digital? And then the second question, how comfortable are you with digital auditions? Very comfortable, comfortable, somewhat comfortable, completely lost. we'll just give a moment to give everyone a chance to chime in. Okay. I'll give it 10 more seconds. Sort of 10. There we go. So that's really interesting. And we have a range of experience in terms of what you've been doing lately. And a lot of people feeling just somewhat comfortable as the most popular response, which I think puts us in a really excellent place to start learning some stuff. Let's see if you feel more comfortable at the end.
Well, that is definitely the hope. Thank you, everyone, for the introductions. Thank you for having me participate in this. Hi, everyone. So I'm Alex. This poll thing keeps popping up right in front of me. Is there any way to stop it from just jumping right in the center? I haven't used polls before.
I thought I had just closed it. Ilona saved me.
Maybe it's going to stay over there this time. Okay, I kept on jumping right into the center every time I tried moving it. Yeah, so I've been, I guess, professionally acting for like 9-10 years. For the past 8 or so years, I had started working in casting houses, doing everything from working the camera to being reader, and then eventually moved into all of the processing for self-tapes, as well as creating sides and reading through all of the different scripts that we get in, comparing it to the previous drafts, just looking for every single tiny little change that would happen in there and keeping track of it as well. And the reason I bring this up will become more relevant later. For some projects, some TV shows, like big US TV shows, big US movies, whatever it is that are shooting here, we would sometimes get 3 or 4 drafts a week with updates on the script. And this would be changes where characters would change age ranges, genders, full-on descriptions, whatever it is, they get cut out, they get added. And the reason I bring this up is because the main sort of mentality that I've come across having started working with people on optimizing and feeling comfortable in the audition room is the idea that they put these auditions out there and they don't feel anything back. They don't feel like they get any sort of validation, any sort of feedback. And it feels like you're just sending this creativity off into some sort of dull, dark void, which can be very discouraging. But at the same time, when you then get a new audition, it sometimes sort of can trap you in the mentality that, wow, I really need to do a good job in doing this because clearly I'm probably doing something wrong if I'm not hearing anything back. So that's why I kind of brought that up to begin with, is there are so many changes happening all the time that the general rule is the best audition of the day doesn't get the part. And that's kind of a weird thing to wrap your head around, is the best audition of the day doesn't necessarily get the part because of all of these moving parts in a project or production. So many small things can change that we as the performers have no idea about. So the ultimate goal that I want to be accomplishing with everyone here today is owning your audition space, having fun, and just doing what you can to explore story and the environment, because that's honestly why everyone's here. We love acting, we love storytelling, and that is the main thing to bring in there. As soon as you put into the idea that you need to do a good job, you are most likely trapping yourself into an ideal performance that can't and shouldn't exist, because stories in many ways should be flawed by default, because that sort of represents humanity and what humans go through. So with that preamble out of the way, I don't know, Deena, if we want to do any questions as we jump through here, or like if you see anything that's pertinent, feel free to jump in and ask. Otherwise, I'm going to just start covering different topics. And this actually goes for everyone else here. If you have any questions that you're inspired to ask right away, please ask it. And many other people probably have the exact same question, and it will probably help others. But either way, first I'm going to go over just covering the technical setup itself, like what equipment should we be looking at, what sort of space should we be looking at. And the answer is, we only need two things for a quote unquote good self-tape, which is we want to see you clearly and we want to hear you clearly. That's pretty much it. So as long as you have those two things covered, honestly, whatever you have going is probably going to be supporting your story pretty well. But obviously, there are lots of ways that we can optimize this to sort of give better representation of your story in there. So the first thing is your environment itself, your room. Obviously, we want to have a room that has as few distractions as possible. So in order to see you clearly, hear you clearly, we don't want to have visual distractions in the background. So I know this is being recorded and we're going to see my horrible closet back here. This is actually my sound booth as well. You see it's filled with prop clothes, with foam, with just a whole bunch of stuff. And if I'm doing a self-tape and I have that as my background, you can see that many times it's probably going to be more interesting looking at what's back there than it is looking at me. I mean, obviously as a performer, I hope not, but we don't want to have distracting backgrounds. So try to stay away from bookshelves, things with TVs, shiny things, whatever it is, bright, shiny things. Aim for some sort of generic dull background. And I would also suggest aiming for darker colors. So the industry standard that I prefer is a dark neutral gray. It's not even the one that I have back here. I just happen to get on sale and it does the job. But a dark neutral gray is actually one of the best colors you can choose. So darker or lighter, we just want to stay away from completely black, excuse me, and completely white. And the reason why is as soon as we start getting lighting involved, white backgrounds can really brighten up the scene too much, that most cameras will get confused. And if it's too dark back there, then once again, the camera can get confused because it's just doing a balance of all the light that it sees on there. So a neutral gray is probably one of the best ones. Actually, for those on the West Coast that I see, in Vancouver especially, they like having a sort of blue background. And honestly, that's fine too. My preference is still the gray because I feel the gray leaves a little bit more room for imagination for the people who are watching it. But hey, that's good. Other things for the room itself is the sound. If you have something even as simple as a fan or an AC in there, those can actually be picked up by microphones and amplified much more so than you would expect. So just turning those off, if you can, makes a huge difference for microphones. And obviously, sorry?
I was just going to offer this one that I learned the hard way. I turned down my fridge because it's a really old, noisy fridge. And if I turn it down, then the compressor turns off.
Hey, when I'm doing shoots, if there's a fridge within 30 feet, I will unplug the fridge too. And that's actually a very good point you brought up there.
And I also learned the hard way to stick some tissue in the doorbell.
Oh, hey, that's clever. I like that. For fridges and ACs, it's sorry, I'm a bit of a nerd sometimes. It's the compressor. The compressor in there is what makes a lot of noise. And to humans, we don't really hear it that much, but microphones, they really pick it up and it can become distracting for the self-tapes. So that's pretty much it for the room, honestly. I know it sounds simple enough, but the nitty and gritty comes down to how do we start setting up our space now that we've chosen an ideal one? And one of the big rules, you'll see it all the time, but it's sometimes hard to remember, is when it comes to shooting on your phones. By the way, phones are perfectly fine. You don't need to have an expensive DSLR with a high quality lens or anything like that. I mean, you can if you want to. They look beautiful, but pretty much any phone made in the last 8 years is probably more than adequate for shooting your self-tape. Just make sure that you turn it sideways. We'll actually see an example of this later on. And the reason why is if you have it in portrait or vertical or whatever you want to call it, when it captures the image and then you upload it, sometimes wherever you're sending it doesn't understand how to process it, and it tries to fit it into a frame that's wide. So if you have a tall image that gets stretched out to wide, we get a very wide image in the end. I just saw a question here that'll say iPads, honestly, like good as well. Tablets on your computer itself can be used as well if you find a way to safely get it high enough. And that sort of brings us over to the next thing, setting up the camera. The camera should be usually your eye height, if not a little bit higher. And it doesn't matter how you get it up there, honestly. It can be a tripod, it can be a light stand. I'll show you some very DIY ways, do-it-yourself ways later on, where you can get the camera up there, but you usually want the camera up at that height. Because the alternative is, or I should say, the reason why, if you watch TV shows, movies, most of the time cameras are set that way. And if you get into the psychological aspect, that's kind of what brings people into the story with you. They feel like they're on the same plane as you as they're talking. So even if I give an example here and have the camera below me, you can sort of feel the difference of this height. And this is only about 1 foot lower than I am right now. And this is just a couple inches. And if I move it around the other way, there we go. So you can sort of feel the difference with changing around the camera height. The other thing with this is your readers should also be roughly the same height as your camera. And this is going to be getting into more of the technical aspects itself of the actual performance and setting up the environment. So if we don't have the readers near the height of the camera and you're talking to the reader who's like sitting down and you're doing a standing scene, it's most likely going to be making us lose your face. And as we said before, we want to see you clearly and hear you clearly. That goes for your seeing your eyes as well. The eyes are the windows to the soul, as they say.
Quick question, Alex, which is jumping ahead a little bit, but given the number of times the slate asks for full body, how do you reconcile that with the horizontal orientation?
So we have a couple of ways of doing that. Sometimes it's just really not feasible. And what we used to do in the past and now is generally not as they don't like it as much, is we'd have the camera and we would tilt it down and then tilt it up again to sort of frame the whole body. And it's weird. It's weird to do, honestly. And if you're shooting this alone or with not an ideal tripod, which most people don't have, and that's okay, then it's just very awkward to do it. So one thing you can do is you can just have a separate shot that is portrait. But if you can do portrait as in where the phone is vertical, and if you can edit that onto your video, it'll be able to upload just fine. And I know some people who always have a separate slate file that they always use regardless of the audition. That's getting a little bit harder to do these days, where they're getting extremely particular with what they're asking for in slates.
Blood type.
Yeah, pretty much. So that's another way you can do it. And to be completely honest with you, if you don't do the slate exactly how they want and they don't cast you because of that, probably won't happen. You probably don't even want to be working with them anyway. In the end, we're working actors. We have stuff to do, and going through an entire change of setup just to capture those 3 seconds or whatever of a slate, I wouldn't be stressing about it. What I do most of the time is I just shoot a little bit wider, just maybe get down to my knees, maybe my thighs, and I do that as my full body slate instead. They're just looking to get a feel for what your whole physicality is. And 9 times out of 10, maybe even 99 times out of 100, they don't need to see your whole body. So don't put the energy there if you don't want to. And you can blame me if they say anything about that. So do what you can, do the best you can, but it's not a make or break deal.
I learned something from somebody in one of your workshops, actually, for those who want to get involved in like fancy editing stuff, and I'm shitty at that. But I have a full body still photo that I just plop on the screen and then do my video slate in the medium close. So they're kind of like side by side.
Yeah, that's another great way to do it. If you're comfortable with editing, that's a perfectly fine way. Like I said, the point of the slate is kind of twofold. Originally, the idea was they used that as a labeling system in videos. They literally held up a chalkboard slate with their information written on there, kind of like a mugshot. And that has sort of just stayed in the industry now, where we just stand there and we say all of our information anyway.
Speaking of labeling.
Yes.
We were chatting earlier, and I was sort of asking, why on earth are we still doing slates, given that it's kind of an antiquated thing? And your answer was?
Just because they are.
Because so many people actually label their
files. Oh, that one
badly.
too, yeah. That's pretty much the only real purpose they serve now. Is a lot of times people send in video files that are like IMG_8765, or that just has a first name of the performer, or sometimes just the name of the role itself. So I've working on a Hollywood film, I'm getting submissions, many submissions, where the video file is labeled cop.mov. And we were working on 6 projects at the same time. One of them was called Canadian Detective, and another one was called Jack Ryan. So you can imagine that we have a lot of cop roles that are being cast. So the poor staff who's working there now has to figure out where this cop role belongs in all of them. So the slate can also help with that, where it's saying the name, the agent, the height, sometimes the role and the project. But that was, sorry, I was actually technically segueing into the other thing, is labeling your files is crucial. And make sure you always have your full name in the file, as well as the role you're auditioning for. If you want to get extra fancy, you can put the project in there too. We had that in the, pretty much in the self-tape request that we sent out to everyone as well, is the pretty much that exact same format. And people followed it very nicely. Good job for the submissions we have in there.
I just want to voice a comment from Kate, who's mentioned that the slate is a chance to present yourself, your personality outside of the character, which can be a great thing to do.
Yeah. I see a lot of people use slates as an opportunity to be even more friendly. I see some people who use the opportunity of the slate to sort of carry the feeling of the character or whatever it is into there, into the slate. And some people just throw it away. It's honestly, whatever feels good for you is perfectly fine. I would actually suggest trying all those different versions too when you do the slate. Sound, lighting. So before I had mentioned, we're going to get going very broad topics, and I'm going to get much more specific as we go on. Sound and lighting. So before I had mentioned that the camera doesn't really matter, but the room does. So when it comes to capturing anything that's video, and this is true for everywhere from Hollywood productions all the way down to your home video, your camera and your microphone, the quality of your camera and the quality of your microphone tend to not matter as much as the quality of your light and the quality of your sound environment. If you have a bad microphone in a fantastic location, it will most likely sound incredible. If you have a super expensive microphone in a noisy bus stop with a stampede going on at the same time, obviously it's not going to be useful. So once again, a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on the ideas of you have to get the most expensive equipment, and that's not true. And it's also one of the reasons why you're here. I'll be sharing an equipment list later on with some suggestions on there. Actually, pretty much everything I have. This, by the way, is my entire self-tape travel kit. everything I need for sound, lighting, my tripod, even my camera, everything fits right into this bag and is actually in there already. So I'll go over that later on. So setting up your space, what I do suggest is getting one decent microphone that can capture you well and one decent set of lights. The lights will be able to carry through whatever cameras you end up getting on, and the microphone you'll be able to use forever. The microphones I had used in the past used to be shotgun mics. I don't think I have it in this, but oh yeah, I had it in there anyway. So a shotgun mic is just a microphone where it sort of captures sound in a cone in front of it like a shotgun. That's why it's called that. And if you've been on sets before, you've seen that they have these on boom poles and they just hang them right over the head of the cast. And then many TV series, sometimes you just sort of see them dipping into frame too. And that's because microphones work better the closer they are to the source. So a lot of people I see, and I'm used to do this for years as well, have used shotgun mics in their self-tape setups. And it's still a great option, but the challenge is, how do you get this really close to you? And because of that difficulty, I have since moved on to using lavalier mics or lav mics as my preferred choice. I was just using it on set yesterday, so it's not in my bag. It's okay, I think you know what a lav mic looks like. It's a microphone at the end of a cable that can attach onto the shirt. So the nice thing about a lav is you don't have to hide it under anything when you're doing a self-tape. Their suspension of disbelief is nice enough because they're watching you shoot this wherever you're shooting it with your backdrop, with your own lighting setup, imagining your environment. It's okay if they're going to see a lav mic on you there. But the nice thing about it is no longer location dependent like a shotgun is. And as you move around, it's moving around with you. And it also captures a very nice close presence because it's always going to be right on the center of your chest as you're listening to it. Saw someone over here mentioning Rode makes a great lav set. Completely agree. That's actually the one I recommend. There is also a cheaper option in there that I listed. Most of them are probably fine. I would suggest spending the extra $20, $30 on a good lav. And the reason why is because of the interference that you can get from cheaper materials and cheaper shielding in there. But that's a whole other topic that we don't need to cover. So for the lav, see if you can spend a little bit extra money on there. If you are using a shotgun, once again, it's perfectly fine, but try to get it as close to you as possible. And this makes setup a bit trickier. If you put it on top of your camera and move it farther and farther away from you, you can probably hear the difference as I move my microphone farther away from me, and you can hear more and more of the room space. So that's the same thing. You guys can still hear me over here, right? Okay, good. I don't know how much Zoom is actually compensating for all of that. So with a shotgun mic, even if it's far away and attached right to your camera, odds are it's still capturing a lot of the room, capturing a lot of the reverb and echo, and it's not giving that nice sort of presence. The extra huge benefit that I love about the lav, and this was told to me by Matt Newton when he came to Montreal for a cold read workshop, was the lav can capture that extra bit of intimacy that is impossible to have on a shotgun unless you have a dedicated sound person putting it right next to your face. The idea that the lav can capture hesitations of breath, it can capture sniffles, it can capture all of those things that are just so human and so present and so connected that it can bring a whole extra bit of depth to your auditions. So I highly suggest getting a lav and playing around with one of those. If you really want a shotgun, they work just fine.
Couple of questions, Alex.
Yeah.
First, the equipment list.
Yes.
We're going to share that later, right?
Yeah, I can.
Rather than
I can
have people
say it
following
right now
along now.
too. It's isolaction.live/equipment.
We'll get that and throw that in the chat. If you're using a lav, what are the implications for your reader? Is it going to pick up enough of the room to get the reader, or do you need to mic your reader separately?
That's another great question. idea of the reader itself is actually a fun component of self-tapes. The goal of the reader is to support and encourage the story of the performer and not to overshine, overshadow, whatever the right metaphor is. Apologies, I only got 4 hours of sleep from an all-night shoot, so I might be a little bit more disjointed than normal. So the goal of the reader is to sort of encourage and push and challenge the performer. Otherwise, the sort of opposite of that same spectrum, which is still true, otherwise the reader is allowed to just be there to just bounce the lines back and help carry the story forward. The opposite of both of those is readers who steal the scene by being too present, too big, and derail the story. So with that, we don't really need to hear the reader to, we don't need the reader to be loud. And with a lav mic and with a shotgun mic, both of those will reject the reader just by distance or by whatever focus that they have. And that will be perfectly fine. So even if I have a lav on and my reader is 9 feet away from me, 3 meters, it'll pick them up just fine. And we don't need to do extra due diligence for capturing them.
What if you've got a reader over Zoom?
Readers over Zoom. This is another good question. If you guys have done this before, or even readers over any sort of technology like just a speakerphone, when a microphone is recording something coming from a speaker, many times it has more amplification to it. So whenever you're doing this, record one safety take. Always do one safety take if you're not completely familiar with your setup, and make sure it looks good and it sounds good. Back to the first 2 rules. We want to hear you clearly and see you clearly. And hearing you clearly also has to do with the idea of the reader not stealing the show in terms of volume. So I usually have, for a Zoom style reader or electronic reader, whatever it is, I make sure that I turn the volume down a little bit more.
Does it make a difference if you've got a reader over Zoom, if they're using a mic or not?
In my experience, it doesn't make a huge difference, especially if you're using something like Zoom. Zoom is getting better and better with their voice processing, where it's starting to remove more and more of the background noises. And on top of that, since the reader isn't going to be too loud anyway in the scene, the loudest part will still most likely be just their voice, and that should work fine.
Quick follow-up question on lavs. How's that work for singing auditions?
That is a good question, and unfortunately, I am not fully knowledgeable on how to handle singing auditions specifically. I would assume that it would still be roughly the same, because I haven't worked with those huge dynamic ranges that you can get with singing in there. But honestly, it should be mostly the same.
If there's any musical theater folks in attendance, feel free to pipe in with opinions about mic setups for the auditions you've done. I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but there are a number of questions about eyeline in terms of camera.
Fantastic.
And particularly if you're doing a Zoom audition, whether it's live or self-taped.
Great. I will cover that soon. I'll just finish off with lighting first. So that's pretty much everything about sound. The extra complications that we get with, I am just going to grab my lav real quick anyway. There we are. Okay. Don't you love it when everything's within arm's reach? So this is the Rode Lav Go, which is on the recommended equipment list. And it's just a cord here. There's an extension cord I recommend as well, because otherwise you only have about this much space between you and where your camera is, and usually you want to have a bit more freedom to move around. So the lav can clip directly right onto the shirt. So if I were miking this shirt, usually it's pretty much a lav as you want dead center of the chest. And you have a clip, and I just literally clip it on right there. to make sure that it's not rubbing the fabric and it's sticking out a little bit. There's plenty of tutorials online on how to do this. And for most framing, it's probably going to be out of the frame anyway when it's being used. So that's pretty convenient. If you're shooting with a phone or with a laptop or anything but a dedicated camera, you'll probably need to get an extra cable. And this is listed in the equipment list, so I'm not going to go into full detail. But pretty much it's the idea that you have to get a connector that has extra plastic rings on it when it's going into your computer compared to what the lav has. So you can see that there's 2 plastic rings on the lav, and there are 3 plastic rings on the adapter. This is all on the list, so that'll be able to help you out from there. And if you have an iPhone, of course, you'll have to have an adapter for that as well. I noticed some people mentioned that they did use the lav and shotgun for singing just fine. So makes sense that that works. Thank you for validating that. And just like someone else mentioned, with music accompaniment going, just like having a virtual reader, make sure to turn it down because it does pick it up a bit more. Lighting.
There's a couple of questions about sound I want to just grab before we move on.
Let's do it.
When you're using an external mic, whether it be lav or shotgun, is that creating a separate file that you then have to edit?
It is not. So when you're using your phone itself and you have your headset plugged into it, it's just using whatever microphone adapter as an extension of the microphone, or in replacement of the microphone that's being used on your phone or your camera as well. So it just becomes integrated with the actual capture that's happening. I do know some people who capture use a second recording device for their auditions. I think that's a bit too much and a lot of work involved. But hey, if you love doing that, then by all means, go for it. We're doing art. You should do what you love.
And before we move on, because we've been talking about slates a bit, there were a few people with questions about if it's not specified whether the slate should be a head or tail slate. Is there an industry standard around that?
As far as I know, there is no standard.
What would be the recommendation?
The recommendation that I do, and this once again has come from a couple of years of working in casting and processing literally thousands of self-tapes. I prefer separate files for my auditions as well as my slates. So if it is not specified, the rule of thumb for submissions is read the document. Excuse me. Read the requirements that they have on there. And they pretty much always have something in there about at least what they want in the slate, sometimes about framing, sometimes about performance and tone, even though it's not always useful. And sometimes about the file naming convention and what they want to see in each file as well. So if I don't see anything about how to submit the actual files, I always by default submit separate files for every take, including the slate. This way they can jump to whatever they want to watch. If they want to share it off to production or the directors or whatever it is, and they want to choose a specific take to send first. We did that in casting a lot. Sometimes people would send 3 takes, and we thought takes 2 and 3 were great to send on to production, and 1 not so much. So if it were 1 file, we'd have to go in there and edit it and cut out takes 2 and 3 separately. And if we liked 3 even more, then we would put that one first. And then we would send that forward saying, hey, here is the suggested order of what we think you would like to see for the portrayal of this role. So I like to just jump the corners on all of that and send my files separately marked.
And then a quick follow-up question on readers. A few people asking about pre-recorded or reader apps. What are your thoughts about the value or danger of that?
So if I could use one word to describe what I see missing most in auditions, because I do I do acting coaching, audition coaching, all of that. I have my audition workshop as well. If I could use one word, even from having worked in casting, if I could use one word to describe what I see missing in most audition performances or performances like that, is listening. That's the one word. And I'm not using the word listening as the idea of hearing what the other words are. I mean, listening to the other person's body language, listening to their doubt, listening to their hesitations, listening to the words that they want to be saying but aren't saying. And just as importantly, listening to yourself, listening to your own thoughts of what you want to say and are holding back, listening to all of this love or this hurt or whatever it's going on, and not just hearing whenever your cue is going to be happening and responding to that. So to answer your question a little bit more directly, if it comes down to virtual or pre-recorded readers or whatever it is, I've seen them work tremendously in auditions, and I've also seen them pull me right out of the story. So if you feel comfortable with being caught off guard every single time that you're listening to a pre-recorded one, it's probably just fine. And I've seen people like where I didn't even notice that it was pre-recorded because they just did such a good job at being present and listening, like I said. So it's a different skill set. If you get comfortable with it and if you're getting good results, then by all means, keep doing it. It makes it even easier for you to not have to look for a reader anymore. But that's just like cold reading, just like teleprompt reading, or whatever it is a different skill. So make sure that you are able to still be present and carry the story forward.
So basically, if you can sell it, anything works.
That's it. That's kind of like the motto of Hollywood, isn't it? Yeah, so the lighting, unless we have any other questions on sound, we're going to go into lighting. So lighting is also where I recommend putting a little bit more money than into whatever camera you have. Lighting, just like getting a microphone that's too cheap, which might introduce hisses, can pick up radio sounds, it can create buzzing with like cheaper connectors, a whole list of things that can go wrong with just getting cheap sound. Lighting has something similar. So even though you might see a nice big light that's super cheap, there's a good chance that what it's doing is creating a color cast. If you want to go into the technical nitty-gritties, this is called CRI, which stands for the Color Rendering Index. And the CRI can go all the way up to 100, which is perfect color representation. That's what you get from the sun, yay, or from natural sources of light. Anything that's electric probably won't. Hey, technology is great. Probably won't get to 100, but a lot of lights out there are already 85 or above, which is great for video. So the one light that I have on my recommended list is from a company called Aputure, Aputure. And they make a great lineup of lights that have great color representation. Unfortunately, they are a little bit more expensive. The one model I have on there is, I don't have it with me because I have two of their other lights I use. It's about this big. It is incredibly bright and has great color representation. And I think it's around $130 or so. It's got a couple of different ways to power it. You'll have to look into which one works best for you. And anything from Aputure is fantastic. I am currently looking at a few other options right now, which I will add to the list later this week, because the previous ones I had on there were discontinued, unfortunately. But getting a good lighting setup it helps tremendously. And you can get away with having one light. I would recommend, if you can, having two. And if you really love lighting and plan to do a lot more work with I don't know, photography, cinematography, or short films or whatever it is, then going for a 3-point lighting system is also pretty nice. You can, I'm not going to go into that today because it's pretty technical, but it's what you'll see with most YouTube vloggers doing in there is a 3-point lighting system because it creates more depth and more dynamics in one frame. But anyway, the 2-point lighting system is what I recommend. The one that I had for years was I had a lamp pole and I had 3 extra bulbs on that lamp. And then I got where'd it go? And then I got a big plastic bag that I put on top of those lamps to create a softbox. And that was my one light source. And then some other point later on, I got a second lamp pole and I moved one of my lights over there. And I had one with a plastic bag and one without. And that was my 2-light setup, which is pretty much the key light and the fill light. The key light is the idea of the one light that really lights up the focus of whatever your image is, which is you. So your key light usually has a much more direct light right on you and probably creates shadows. The fill light does exactly what the name implies. It fills in those shadows and gives a sort of softer representation of all of that. So if you look at what setup I have right here, all I have is a 2-point light setup. You can see I have this really big softbox over here, which is my fill light. And then I have an LED over on this side, which is the key light. See, someone else mentioned plastic garbage bags as well. That's awesome. Obviously, make sure that you're not putting it on anything that gets hot. We don't want anything melting or burning. Most LEDs, if not most LEDs, won't get that hot. So obviously test it first. The aperture light, I think, doesn't get hot.
Kitchen parchment paper up here.
Oh, kitchen parchment paper. I keep forgetting. That is a great one. That's not going to burn. Yeah. It's just a little bit harder to position on there. And I will go into some
clothes pegs are for.
Sorry?
That's what clothes pegs are for.
Yeah, got clothespins for that. Can bend some clothes hangers, or my favorite piece of equipment, which I'll show a little bit later on, which is I think everyone should have this, whether or not they're an actor, filmmaker, or whatever, but I'll get there soon.
Oh, ooh, that's a teaser. What thoughts on ring lights?
Personally, I am not a fan of ring lights, and I've heard this. I've heard that same sentiment resonates with a lot of casting directors. And the reason why is kind of twofold. One of them is the optics of what it creates. Ring lights were originally created for the idea of specifically beauty or glamour shots, where it would be right around the lens and you'd get right up in someone's face, and it would create this lovely featureless, shadowless image, as well as a circular light right around the eyes to bring extra focus to it. And they use that, I think, in fashion and modeling a lot. And while it is incredibly convenient, it is really convenient for self-tape setups, I do find that specifically that ring light reflection in the eyes can be a bit more distracting. So full disclaimer, I have seen some people position it in such a way where I don't even notice the ring lights in the eyes, but I find more times than not, it's pretty distracting. And casting directors, I've heard a handful of casting directors say that too. And number two, the other part of the twofold is many times for the ring lights, they are probably going to be a lower CRI, which is what we mentioned before. So it could be creating a falser representation of your skin tones, of the general colors. And while it may not be immediately obvious to people who are watching it, those little superficialities do end up counting. Which kind of brings me to another anecdote. I'm fully aware that I will be saying very contrasting things throughout this whole thing, which is your setup doesn't really matter as long as we can hear you and see you, and that having a good setup is good. And the reason why in that is imagine casting is getting two equally good performances across the board, both captivating, both good storytelling. But one of them has a cleaner, more beautiful image and better sound where we can hear everything better. And the other one's a little bit more washed out, a little bit, who knows, greener or something because of color cast, a little more background noise, wider frame. And they send this on to production, which is sometimes 10 to 20 different people deciding if they want to cast someone. And you can see how very quickly those extra little bit of superficialities that are in there might start adding up to end up making a difference in the casting choice. So it's not a make or break, generally speaking, but that little bit of effort can add up and can help over time. That generally is pretty much for lighting. 2 light sources, 1 direct light, 1 sort of fill light. Play around with how you position them. There's plenty of tutorials online about positioning 2 light sources, 3 light sources, but see what works for your setup.
Are there angles or heights of positioning the lights that are sort of optimal? And unrelated, how do you know the CRI?
Yeah, see, that CRI is a tricky number, and unfortunately, it's not all over the place. And usually, if you don't see the CRI, it probably means that they either haven't measured it or they're not really thrilled with the numbers, so they don't put it out there anyway. If someone is labeling the CRI, it probably is good. It's not always the case, but that's a whole other topic. Positioning the lights. As you already saw from my setup, there's lots of, like I said, lots of tutorials on how to do that. Generally at the sides, and one rule of thumb that's easy to remember, 99% of light in nature comes from above you. So whenever you have positioning the lights, always see if you can have it just a little bit above you and see how that works. Depending on what you have there, it might be a bit different, but you can see my setup right here. I'm sitting down at this height, and you can see that my softbox is clearly going up much higher than I am. And my key light over here is, I don't know, probably about a foot higher or so. I think that represents it a bit better. And you can see that the image it creates it's pretty decent. It does the job, and it's brings out the contrast nicely.
Any different or particular considerations for melanated people, both in terms of light and background?
Like I said, for the rule of thumb for the background is aim for, I still see it's neutral gray regardless. That's the wonderful thing about it, because neutral gray doesn't bias with any sort of color cast that the camera might be picking up on. I don't know if you've ever noticed before, if you're using your phone and shooting against say an orange background or a blue background, and all of a sudden the colors shift for what the actual object is. And that's called white balance. That's your phone going, I'm not sure what color is white anymore. Is white yellow? Is white blue? It doesn't know, so it does its best guess based off of the image it's getting. And then it'll shift its colors to try and bias that. So if it sees something that has this sort of blue tint, it'll try and add extra orange to compensate. If it sees something that has an orangish tint, it'll try to add extra blue, etc. So the neutral gray is the idea that it doesn't have any color associated with it. And as long as it offers some sort of, in my opinion, as long as it offers some sort of contrast with whatever your skin tone is, that's, in the end, that's all that really matters. If you tend to have a bit darker skin tone, see what it looks like with a little bit of a lighter background. Just avoid pure white and pure black, because like I said, that can really mess around with your sensors.
And in terms of lighting darker skin tones?
I am not aware of the specific differences with that. But the general rule of optics is that the light should be working the exact same. But I'm just not aware.
It's definitely an area of conversation in lighting design at the moment in terms of lighting darker skin tones for stage and film, obviously. And
yep.
the one thing that I keep hearing again and again is it has to do with luminosity, and a lot of it's about makeup and making sure that you've got a luminous surface that's going to bounce?
Yeah. So my guess would be that, once again, cameras love light. So anything you can do to sort of optimize the amount of light that you're doing and to make you stand out more is probably going to help. So I tend to always opt for darker backgrounds. I would suggest playing around with it, but like I said, I don't really know. What you said makes perfect sense. And I know that there's also this whole challenge with how camera sensors specifically can have their own sort of biases in shifts of color as well. And that's a whole other debate. But everyone here, I think, most people are probably using things like cell phones, and giving cell phones, which have very, very, very tiny sensors on there for capturing light, just giving it more light in general gives it much more latitude to work with. Anything else on lighting?
I don't think we've got any specific lighting questions that haven't been thrown in yet. Lots of questions still lingering around.
I did see something about shadows, so I'll just address that really quickly.
Yeah.
If you have one light source that's very bright, it will most likely create shadows. And if that's all you have to work with, hey, that's fine, work with it. Something you can do to minimize shadows is the distance that you are to the wall. So even right now, I'm pretty sure I get my hand closer and closer, you see that I'm creating much more of a shadow over here. And that's because of my key light coming in from over there. So you can see it, yeah. And then Deena has one as well.
You can see my two ghostly friends there.
So if you have the freedom to move, even just moving the position of you or of your light can help make a difference in minimizing those shadows, because shadows, they really can be distracting when you see like you have a silhouette right behind you that's following you for the whole scene. So if you can move away, it's not always easy to do with the setups. That's one way to fix it. The other way is playing around with, as Deena mentioned, the I keep wanting to say baking sheet, parchment paper. Deena mentioned the parchment paper, or anything to sort of diffuse and help scatter the light will make the shadows less direct. Less prominent. I think that's pretty much it for lighting. Let's see what I have over here.
Does having more than one fill light help?
I mean, it can. I mean, you can get away with two fill lights instead of just one key and one fill as well. It's I'm not a professional on lighting. I just know at least the basics enough to light some scenes and light audition rooms, but I don't know everything, sorry. But I have used, and I've actually know plenty of clients who use two fill lights only. And some people who have three, and they're using one as a rim light, halo light, backlight.
A couple of people in the chat are also talking about lighting your backdrop.
Yeah. It is purely optional. If you feel like doing it, you can. It's a nice, the reason we get a light anywhere behind us is for the idea of foreground background separation. In other words, to make you pop out more in front of whatever background you have. So they use that, the light back there is either used to give some sort of contrast to the backdrop itself, or you shine it at you and it creates a sort of rim around you, like a highlight, like an outline. And there's different ways you can use that to create different sort of rims. But once again, I'd suggest Googling that because that's a whole other topic.
Here's a good lighting question. What if for people who wear glasses?
Glasses they can be tricky. And we had, working in casting, we found a lot of fun ways to play around with that. So one thing you can do is getting your lights higher up and angling them down a bit more can be one way to play around with that. I guess the main thing is with glasses, whatever you're looking at is most likely going to be capturing more of the reflection. So if I'm looking towards my key light over here, my key light is going to be creating a very obvious reflection in my glasses. My fill light, not so much. So that one can probably stay there. So I'd get my key light and I'd play around with moving it left and right, moving it up and down. That's one way of doing it. The other way, this works for some people. It doesn't work for others. Depends on your framing too. Once again, play around with it. You'll find something that works and you'll be able to go crazy with it. Some people just even lower the glasses slightly down on their nose a little bit, which changes the angle slightly and will change what the reflections are doing. Just be careful that if you do that, that we can still see, we want to see your eyes. So you don't want the bridge, not the bridge, whatever you don't want the plastic of the glasses covering your eyes on there because it makes it harder for the audience to connect with you. Which probably carries us pretty nicely into eye lines, I think. Yeah. Am I allowed to, can I draw things on here? I'm a terrific artist. I'm gonna use the whiteboard.
I think you can.
I can, cool. I apologize in advance for my Picasso-esque drawing style because I'm not a good artist and I'm drawing with a trackpad. So let's pretend that we have, I do not want yellow. Yellow doesn't show up that nicely. Okay, so let's pretend that we have our camera right here. I was changing the kind of camera I was drawing as I was doing it. Yay, there we go. We got a DSLR and it is on a tripod. Cool. Yeah, I am not an artist. I am an actor. So here we have the camera that's set up. So whatever the camera sees is obviously going to be carrying our story forward. And the more we turn away from our camera, the more we lose our face, our eyes. We're losing the connection that we can be offering to the people watching it. So that's why we get to play around with a couple of rules of thumb. And keep in mind that these are rules of thumb. This is not canon. The reason I'm stressing that is because this is your artistic space. If your heart, your mind, your body moves you to do an impulse in the scene, I want you to follow that every single time. I do not want the idea of, oh, I need to look here for this to be breaking that impulse, because that can stop a story in its tracks. So if anything in the scene makes you really feel like turning around, dipping out of frame, running out of frame and coming back in, and you feel it in the moment, you do it. Because that's what storytelling is. But generally speaking, we try to practice these rules of thumb just to make sure that the image is showing what we want it to see. So the first thing is readers. Everyone can see me, right? Like I have my video also showing at the same time as this, this thing. Are people able to see me at the same time as my beautiful screen? I'm seeing some raised hands. I'm assuming that's a positive raising hands. Okay, great. So the reader, like I said, usually should be on either side of the camera, usually pretty close. We can just imagine that there's the rest of the body attached to these disembodied heads. So the reader's eyes should be roughly around the same height as the lens. That's just your general rule of thumb. The lens is the eye of the camera. Put the eyes of your readers close to there and get them standing pretty close. Even working with camcorders, DSLRs, I pretty much have my shoulder pretty much right next to the camera anyway. And when I'm working with cell phones, I'm almost overlapping with the cell phone when I'm being a reader for it. You don't have to do it like that. Let's put that on the other side, actually. There we go. This is a cell phone, clearly. And this is where the lens is. Ooh, Alex should go to art school. So as a reader, I'm actually standing around here. You don't have to be standing this close, but this is just where I do it because as a cinematographer, I really like that eye line. But I'm standing really close to like behind the camera when I'm being the reader for it. And the reason for that is giving a little bit more presence to the people who are watching it, making it feel like they're a little more connected and a little more involved in my story. You don't need to be this close, but generally the closer you are to it and keeping your eyes close to the same height is a good rule of thumb to follow. The next thing is, and this is pretty much just helps for all eye lines, which is lovely, It's something that in ISO action, we call the magic box. Here is the different version of a tripod now. Yay, that one's on a light stand. So the magic box is the idea that, once again, the camera is the eye of the audience. How do we best make sure that our story is being conveyed to what the camera sees? And that is by putting it in what we call the magic box. Yay, magic box. There it is. The magic box, we'll say, is about 1 foot, maybe 2, depending on your setup. Play around with it. I don't know what that is, 0.3 meters, I guess. So it's about 1 foot up, 1 foot down, 1 foot to the side. If anything in your environment is placed within this magic box, it will most likely translate nicely to the camera. So going back to my video, if I'm using this webcam as my camera for capturing my audition, and let's say I put the reader to one side, once again, I know this camera, I've worked with it. I know that the space I need to play with, my magic box is much smaller. I'm only looking about 4 inches or so, 9 centimeters off to the side. And when I look over like that, and I'm keeping it right near the height of the lens, you can see that this feels pretty connected, as if I'm talking to someone who's right off camera. And then if I need to switch that over to the other side, I go the exact same distance over to the other side. So I'm looking over here. And here I have a second eye line if I want to play around with that. Now, the same thing is true for, let's say that I need to be looking up at the sky or looking down at the ground for whatever it is. I'm looking at the wonderful flowers, or I'm looking at the clouds. If you were to shoot this as it actually would be, where you're looking up at the sky and we're having some sort of reaction we want to capture, and I look all the way up there at the sky, you're losing so much of the storytelling that could be happening here. And on top of that, it's not the most flattering of angles. Same thing as if I'm looking actually down at the ground. So if we bring the magic box into this, where instead, I'll probably put it about 1 foot. That's less than 1 foot. About 8 inches above or 8 inches below. And I'd make this my ground eye line instead. I look down at it like that. It probably looks like I'm looking at the ground, even though I'm not. And you can still stay connected to whatever I'm doing here. Same thing for that same distance, which was here. And I bring it above the camera. And now I look up at like this, and it feels like I'm looking up at the ceiling or closer to the sky. And you can see how the camera itself sort of redefines what the environment is. So as performers, we get to redefine what our environment is too, to stay onto there. Does that make sense to everyone? The sort of idea of the magic box?
How do you translate that if you are dealing with a reader on Zoom, whether that be in recording a self-tape or in a live Zoom audition?
Hey, that's another great question. And this is where using a smartphone or a laptop can actually really help you with that. So just to finish this off, Magic Box, I never use anything on the center line. Anything that's too close to the center of the camera or the lens, to me, sort of breaks the axis. And it can kind of make it feel too involved with, if I'm looking right below the lens, it could feel to the viewer like, oh, they're looking down at me or something, because it's sort of breaking that fourth wall. So I avoid anything on the axis itself. So I guess my magic box is more like a magic axis, magic parallel lines. But hey, you get the idea. I'm using the wrong thing here. There we go. But yeah, you get the idea. 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot. Cool. Next question was the eye lines if you're using a computer screen. Hey, look, I can do rectangles very well. This is my computer, and this is my, that's my little lens that's right up there. And I'm doing a Zoom audition. So many times, if we're doing a Zoom audition, people have the tendency to just maximize the screen, and we just put our reader right there. And what does this do? It does exactly what I had just mentioned I like to avoid, which is my eye line then becomes directly below the camera, and all of a sudden it's bringing this strange engagement into the audition. So what I do every single time when I'm doing a Zoom audition is I make my window smaller. I'm going to use a different color over here. I make my Zoom window smaller and I bring it up and off to the side. That's it. So I put the person right over here, and then this gives me my mini magic box distance that I like to have. It's, for me, my screen, the place I like to look is halfway between my lens right there and the edge of the screen. And halfway is, once again, just this distance. So I put the little window right over there, and it creates that same sort of illusion. I should have mentioned this disclaimer beforehand, but I'll mention it now. Why not? We are improvising some things. Actually, no, I kind of mentioned this already. If anything you're doing is taking you out of the story, reevaluate that. We do not want you following an eye line because I told you to do it, or because it tends to work. If you are doing that and it is pulling you out of the story, find something else that works for you, or practice it until it does work for you. And playing around with the environment in the eye lines is fantastic, not just for helping to, bring the viewers into the engagement of the story, but also you'll notice your imagination starts warming up over time as you keep doing it. And as soon as a director or anything else changes some environmental aspect, whether or not it's actually happening there, the imagination gets to fire up and be like, oh yeah, cool. And I'll position it right over here and work with the camera that's going. So building these eye lines and practicing them all of a sudden becomes this huge asset in your storytelling tool belt that you can bring to all sorts of sets, not just your auditions. And this includes things like video game work, or working with green screens, blue screens, or what's it called? The cube, which is what they use to shoot The Mandalorian. So all of a sudden, working on these imaginary eye lines gets that imagination, allowing you to bring anything you need to bring into the environment with you and start dealing with it, changing the size, shape, location. And in essence, it helps you escape even more into the scene, even more into the story going on, because the imagination is carrying you through that instead of a lot of those other technicalities that we try to bring in there. So going back to it, play around with the eye lines, work on them. Do not let the rules of the setup dictate your performance, though. Let it assist it.
So if you've got a reader on Zoom, maintaining eye contact with that window wherever you've placed it is not the critical thing.
If it's hard, so let's say that I'm working with someone and it's hard for them to connect to that tiny space because they just feel disconnected. I would say, let's change around the layout of it. See what happens if we just make them even bigger and off to the side. See if that makes a difference.
I'm a big fan of Post-it notes.
Post-it notes work, little dots. The one thing I would say playing around with that too is when we are using something like a physical feature for an eye line, like if we just have a tiny little X there or whatever it is, the idea is that is guidance as opposed to the eye line. So for everyone, I would say play around with practicing loose focus on it. If you really want to fire up the imagination, and I'm using just an imaginary eye line like this, I would say see what happens if you picture some sort of fuzzy factor face. I'm just using some F's in there. A fuzzy factor face. It doesn't have to be a fully detailed face, but the idea that you just know that's where your eye line is. So you sort of, does that look like a dot figure smiley face? That looks just like a mess of dots. I'm going all Jackson Pollock now. Excuse me. So just the sort of the idea of a face in there. And the reason why I'm saying a face instead of just an eye line is when you're talking to someone, whether you realize it or not, you are inadvertently looking from eye to eye and down to their mouth, up to their eyebrows. You're looking at each of these different parts subconsciously most of the time, just to sort of pick up on all the micro expressions that are happening in there. So I've seen many times that people just place one solid little dot as an eye line, and they fixate to that. And all of a sudden, I just see them disconnect. I see them just like looking at an object with intense focus because that's where they're supposed to look. And they forget the idea that they're looking at a human that they need to, once again, listen to. So I would really encourage bringing that into there. It's another imagination note, bringing that in there and see if you can see that fuzzy factor face, which I've never used that phrase before in my life until now.
I'm trying to also look at the clock. And I want to make sure we get to the submission stuff. So I'm gonna hold off on throwing in more questions and let you whip through a little bit.
Cool. Yeah, I'll just cover a couple more. This is covering most of the stuff. So I'm going to just jump through the rest of technicalities for environment and then go into a little bit about apps and editing and stuff like that, which is a whole other technological nightmare, unfortunately. But yeah, so technicalities of the environment. The main takeaway I've already said, which is see how much you can fire up that imagination and then just go with that. With the idea that we want to try and focus it onto keeping it near the lens itself in our magic box that we talked about. So I'll just cover some other quick basics in here anyway. Have fun living in that environment. Excuse me. All that coffee is catching up to me. Have fun living in that environment before the self-tape starts, after it ends. See what happens, what it feels like to live in there and be there, being active, doing things in there before the scene starts and after the scene ends. There's a lot of reasons why, but because we are getting shorter on time, I'm not going to go into that. Play around with that. Giving and receiving objects. We have two ways of doing this. One is actually doing the action, where you get a piece of paper. I'm just representing that with this. You get a piece of paper, see if you can actually grab it, hand it over, have it already sitting there so the reader doesn't have to reach from wherever they are and do it, and have it just sitting there already and do it. Or if you're comfortable with it, miming. Miming can be very dangerous in things like self-tapes because as soon as a part of the brain doesn't believe it's happening, it will show on camera. The camera is extremely personal. It captures thoughts, and that's why it's so lovely and becomes so easy to capitalize on the idea that all you have to do is listen, be there, and be present, and the camera's going to do the rest of the work for you. So yeah, giving and receiving objects. You can simply hand them over, have it already preset there, whatever it is. Props in general. Many people say avoid props when you can, and most of the time that's true. If you have props that are critical to the scene, find something to use to represent it. And it doesn't need to be the thing itself. If your imagination believes it enough, that'll do the trick for you, which is nice. Physicality. Sometimes there's kissing scenes, hugging scenes, fight scenes. These things happen in there too. Even something as simple as a handshake. So the idea of intimacy can usually just be captured with the idea of a connection. If it says there's a hug or a kiss or whatever it is, the idea of looking at the other person and giving that appreciation can usually cover that pretty nicely. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time to go into extras on that. A nice thing you can play around with, though, is something that you can always bring in there yourself. And this is what I use in a lot of my tapes, which is if I have that connection, I bring a physical component to it, which looks like this. I want to hug you. And that's the end. So all I did there is I just reached one hand out, brought my other hand right there, and then I held it. And then I had that little physical moment. And this to me just feels like I'm getting a nice connection. I'm getting a physical, intimate thing that I'm sharing with someone else. And many times this can work as a substitute because the idea is just the connection. They're not going to cast you or not cast you because you showed a hug on camera, right? So do what works for you. And this is one that I use all the time when it comes to a thing where I need to connect with someone. I bring one hand out there, and then this is me coming in and just literally putting pressure on it like that. And then it transfers pretty nicely on camera. Same thing can work if there's like some sort of altercation or fight. Giving yourself resistance. I just put my arm out here and grab it and do this if I'm holding someone back. And it can look like this on camera. Hey, no, I want the cookie. I want the cookie. Give me the cookie. So you can see that we still get the some sort of tension and force going on there. Once again, practice it. If it doesn't feel like it works, it probably won't work on camera.
What if you have to come or go in the scene?
Another great question. Yeah, I will cover that right after this question, this topic. The setup of something like a bench scene, a bar scene, sitting at the side of a bed, whatever it is, or in a car happens a lot, is the writer trying to give the idea that a scene takes place side to side? Or are the people sitting across from each other? That is a storytelling component if it is side by side versus across. Side by side, where the person's at your side, means you are giving the characters room to escape. You're giving the characters room to deal with whatever they are dealing with on the inside and have this escape, which is looking out to the park, looking over a balcony, looking across a dinner booth, whatever it is, at emptiness. That character needs that escape for a very good reason, to experience, share, whatever it is. And then they also need to be able to connect with the person over there. So if I were to set up my scene like that, where I'm looking this way and connect over here, what's happening? I'm losing half my face. We don't want to be losing half the face. We want to see all of it. We want to see you clearly and hear you clearly. And I do realize I keep saying them backwards, but they're both equally important. So how do we set that up? We set it up just like we did before. We have two eye lines. One is the one that is the most important eye line. Here we'll say is your escape. So this is me looking outwards. And then the other eye line right on the other side is the reader. And then it looks like this. Oh, really wish I had some cookies right now. You know what I'm saying? Chocolate cookies. Yeah, apparently I'm hungry right now for cookies. So you see how that works. So I have my escape over here. I get to deal with that. I get to imagine whatever my environment is, create that environment. It makes a huge difference. And then when I need to connect, I have my other person on the exact other side right over there. So play around with that, see what works for you. We talked about exiting and leaving scenes, and I will show you some things we can do with that real quick. I'm assuming everyone, yep, okay, microphone's still working. Fantastic. So a lot of times when there is an exit, you don't need to physically exit the scene or re-enter the scene. If it starts off that way, by all means, go for that. Go for the actual physical entrance where I could be starting off frame. And then I go in like, hi, yes, I would like to have 2 cookies, please. I'm stuck on cookies now, apparently. In the middle of a scene, however, personally, I don't like the idea of leaving frame unless I have to or feel the impulse to do it. And the reason why is if there is some sort of scene transition, scene location change, and there's a story component hidden in there, I want to show that on camera. Because many times it can be something someone exits a room and we get to sort of feel that change of them being alone and having their own thoughts to themselves or whatever it is. So that's one option, one reason for why. And I'll show you how that can work. So I'm saying like, okay, cool, I'll see you later. And all I do is I just sort of back up, step and a half, give a sort of break, whatever it is. And then I see my new environment and I walk right in. It's like, oh, hey, yeah, I didn't expect I'd see you here. So that's pretty much it. It's the idea that I can just sort of half step back. Audience is going to completely forgive that. And then I reconnect to my scene and re-enter it. Because to me, the idea of like walking like, oh yeah, so I'll see you in a second. Walking off frame and then coming back on again, to me, it sort of breaks the narrative flow. But it can work. I just prefer the one where you stay on.
I got a slew of kind of technical questions I'd love to throw at you.
I love technical questions.
I don't know how compressed this can be, but exporting, editing, file size.
Yeah. So
Specs for your export. And
I will cover that very shortly to the best of my ability. Honestly, I'll probably send a document with all that information. It's a lot of numbers and random annoying things to remember. So I'll definitely have a document later this week to go more in detail on that for everyone.
okay.
But
So I'll
yes.
throw some other questions at you.
Yeah.
When you're selecting what take you're going to submit as your first take, is it the one you like best or the one that you think most
That's a great question. That's
most addresses what the director might ask for?
So here, I'm going to put that to the side briefly. I just want to answer one other question on here that still fits into framing. But that's a very good question and very hard answer, Deena. Thank you. So just the last bit of framing, since we were just talking about that, is what do you frame for your audition? And the default answer right now is medium close-up. Medium close-up means we're capturing the bust, the chest, the torso, to the top of the head. And we try to minimize what we call head space. Head space is the distance between the top of your head and the top of the image frame, the camera frame. So if we do this, it feels disproportionate. They used to do that a lot, decades and decades ago. But now if you watch things, this is minimized and many times even grazing the top of the hair. So see if you can just minimize that. That's what we do, and medium close up. If your performance needs to have a larger scope to it, if there is a lot of physicality, a lot of movement for whatever reason that needs to be in there and moving around, then we need to give that room to play. So you can give it a bit more room here and shoot closer to a medium shot where we're getting down to the waistline now, and give that room for it to move around. When it comes to, once again, I'm not an expert on theater auditions because I've never done one virtually or
it's
as
a
self-tape.
recurring question. Do you think there's any different guidance for a theater audition versus a recorded media?
So unfortunately, I can't answer that too well, but at least from the knowledge I have, which comes from like video games and work like that, video games love seeing 3/4 shot to full body, which means pretty much down to your knees or your shin and the full body. And the reason why, especially for video games, is that physicality really is helping to tell the story. And they want to see how that physicality comes through. So for theater, what I would guess is probably a wider frame, probably medium. And if the space needs it for whatever performance it is, then go ahead and give it a bit of a wider frame. But I'd probably aim for medium, just so we can sort of like feel how you move around in that little space. But once again, I am not an expert on that.
And we do have another workshop coming up that will be focused more from the casting side of things. So hopefully we can get some of those answers there.
Great. Going back to, so I think that covers framing. Going back to the other question you had asked about choosing your self-tape. This kind of goes under that umbrella of, if you aim for a perfect performance or a perfect tape or doing a good job, it's probably pulling the creativity out of what you would be doing as a storyteller. And that same sort of thing applies to choosing the tape, because a part of you thinks that's what they would want. So that's where this gets tricky. By default, when I'm working with clients, when I'm shooting my own self-tape, I always record one version, which is the way I want to have fun telling the story. And that doesn't mean that I'm doing energy and doing choices for the sake of doing choices. This means that I had some inspiration in me that wanted to go through and tell the story this way, feel the hurt, feel the love, go through this journey. I always do that take. And then the other take I do is generally along the lines that we call the drama take, the grounded take, the flat and fast, the yeah, that's pretty much it. The one where it's a bit more cover on there, a bit more direct, a bit more to the point and going through. And that's the one that I call the drama take. And I usually send these to, not always, but usually. Yeah, I think that's, hey, I'll cover this one last little thing about cars. If you are doing a car scene, by the way, see if you can have something to represent if you're driving, of course, see if you can have something to represent the steering wheel. Usually getting another chair there can work just fine as resting your hands on it. Even if we don't see it in the frame, having that physicality. And we don't need any sort of like a sitcom style driving where we see you turning the wheel or anything like that. We don't need to have any of that. It's just here to rest, and that does the job for you. Last thing about that, framing an environment. How do you sit in the middle of a scene or stand in the middle of a scene without changing the camera framing around? And we have a fun answer for that. So a chair. That sounds obvious, but you'll see what I mean. A chair turned around backwards. So the idea of sitting, if the scene doesn't need to be more sitting than standing or whatever it is, this is a great compromise to give the character the feeling of sitting down and having their energy more rested without having to change the height difference all the way. So here I turn the chair around backwards. I come in here. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I'll sit down. And here now I'm just sort of resting on the back of the chair. Obviously, make sure you can do this safely. I'm resting on the back of the chair, and you can feel I have that sort of grounded energy without having to actually stand up or sit down and change the frame drastically. Cool. Yeah, I think that's that. I will need 5 to 8 minutes to go over the self-tape assignments. So I'm just trying to allot time for that.
Right. Okay.
I mean, I'm pretty much covered everything I want to. I do have some examples on setting up self-tape in very random environments with the list that I have recommended. I could cover that now. It'll be pretty quick.
I'm gonna try and whip through some questions.
Let's do it.
There's a number of that are kind of recurring, and some of these we may have answered in variations, but apologies if there's any redundancy. I think we did that. EcoCast. That's kind of the question.
EcoCast. There's so many different ones that sound the exact same. Is this the one where you have to accept the request to do the audition and then you send it?
If I'm remembering correctly, and I might have to bring Sam into the room for this, EcoCast is one of those platforms where you can tape to the platform.
Oh, okay. I unfortunately have not used that. I've only done recording and then uploading to it.
And then uploading, okay.
Yeah.
Is there an optimal distance between you and the camera?
Great question. So for those of you who shoot on cell phones, I'm assuming most, what you might notice is the closer you get to lens, the wider everything looks, like a fishbowl effect. And that's because lenses on our laptops and on our smartphones, especially the ones that are facing the with the screen, are wider angle lenses because it needs to capture a wider frame in a closer space. The effect then becomes fishbowling, where when I get closer to the lens like this, and even though I'm putting my hand literally 1 foot in front of me, and my hand becomes bigger than my head, you can see how it's emphasizing features differently. What I suggest, if it's possible, when you shoot on your phone, shoot with the one on the back side of it, shoot with that lens facing you. It's 9 times out of 10, it's a better lens, better quality, and you can get it farther away. And if you can do the option where you do ×2 zoom or whatever it is, because I don't know how many lenses phones have now. They just keep on adding +1 every year.
It's like
But
razors.
I know it's but see if you got the ×2 option, because that gets pretty close to representing a lot of the lens length for cinema lenses, roughly speaking. If you don't want to mess with all that, either way, use this one and have it probably a little bit farther away from you if you're comfortable with editing, because this way you can reframe in post too. But honestly, this one works fine. Just make sure you give it, once again, a little bit more space, because we don't want to have that sort of optic change of just the proximity and fishbowl.
How many takes do you send if it's not specified?
If it is not specified, and I have done my 2 takes where I'm doing the one that I'm having fun and the one that fits with that cover realm that we talked about, that grounded one, then I will send the 2. If I have a third one where it's like, wow, this feels really different and a really cool different energy choice, then I will send that. The thing is, we do not want you to be sending more than 1 take where the takes feel the same. And that even includes like, oh, I had this 1 different moment or 2 different moments. That probably will not justify the idea of sending an entirely separate choice. So they should, if you are sending more than 1 and they don't specify, then make sure that they feel different. I probably wouldn't send more than 3 though. If the scenes are short, that will increase my chances of sending more than 1. And by that, I mean like 1 page, maybe 2 pages.
A lot of people are very keen to get information about the editing side of things and the exporting side of things. So I'm just going to reassure everyone that Alex has a handout.
Yes.
That will be made available. And
I will say something just really quickly. Anything that you're comfortable editing on is fine. You don't need the most fancy software. There are a couple of free ones out there that that have good reviews. So if you're on the computer, there's something called Shotcut. So shot like a film shot, and cut like your editing cut. Shotcut. That one's cross-platform. It's open source, completely free, and it'll do the job for you, and gives you a wide range of export options too. Another one out there that's free is DaVinci Resolve. That one it's an advanced editing suite, so it could be very scary to look at if you're not comfortable with it. But if you like the idea of getting into more professional editing, I would recommend DaVinci Resolve. Other than that, anything that's already by default on the computer is fine. iMovie. I've heard of a lot of issues with Windows Movie Maker. But yeah, Shotcut is cross-platform. That one's going to be fine. On the phone itself, I have to go through the whole list of ones that are out there again. The one that I've been using most recently is called the VN, the letter V, the letter N. That's also cross-platform. It gives you a range of export options and allows full editing on there as well. It's just a little annoying to go from VN to uploading to something like Google Drive. So have to figure that one out. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
something totally unrelated, makeup.
We're in a superficial industry. It's like if you are keen with doing makeup and are able to do it nicely, hey, go for it. Something else that's fun in general between different takes. If you have long hair, that can be put up or put down. If you have glasses on, between different takes, try changing the hair a little bit. Try changing the glasses. Have the glasses on for one, off for another. Slight costume changes, like one with a jacket on, jacket off. Those are all great options for just showing different looks even within one audition. Someone else mentioned open shot, and yes, open shot is another good one. I think shotcut, they had just a slightly different feature set, which is why that was the one that I mentioned instead. But open shot also had very good reviews.
I want to make sure you have time now to have a look at
I do.
some samples, and just to reassure everyone that this is being recorded and it will be posted. So if you missed bits or want to go back over things, it will be available.
So we got 4 submissions from people. So if you submitted, yay, thank you so much. Great practice. It is always great to practice this and see it. And also thank you for letting us share and use these ones in advance. So I'm going to go through all 4 submissions in one go, no breaks. And then I'm just going to go really quickly back to them to go over it. So if we have any issues with hearing or seeing what's going on here and it's not playing properly, please let me know. Here we go.
Hey.
Hi. So, what's the story with this one?
Oh, come on.
I'm your best friend. I worry about you.
Well, you shouldn't, because I'm perfectly fine.
What's this?
He got tickets for the show I wanted to see in New York. What's wrong?
What? No. So, how are things going with you? Okay? How's your work today?
It was okay.
Okay. Well, I'll catch you in the morning. End scene. Hi, I'm Gord Milroy. I am 5'8", and I live in Toronto.
Hi. So what's the deal with this one? I'm your best friend, and I worry about you.
Well, you shouldn't, because I'm perfectly fine.
So what's this?
He got tickets for the show I wanted to see in New York. What's wrong?
What? No. So how's everything with you? Okay? How was your work today?
It's okay.
Catch you tomorrow.
Hey.
Hi. So what's the deal with this one?
Oh, come on.
I'm your best friend, and I worry about you.
Well, you shouldn't, because I'm perfectly fine.
What's this?
He got tickets for the show I wanted to see in New York. What's wrong?
What? No. So how is everything okay? How was work today?
It was okay.
Okay. Catch you in the morning. Hi there. I'm Tim Dixon. I'm 5 feet 11 inches tall. My pronouns are he and him. I'm based in Nanaimo, but I can work as a Vancouver local. And I am available for the outside dates except for the possibility of November 18th. Thanks for watching.
Hey!
Hi. So what's the deal with this one?
Oh, come on.
I'm your best friend, and I worry about you.
Well, you shouldn't, because I am perfectly fine.
What's this?
He got tickets for the show I wanted to see in New York. What's wrong?
Nothing. What? What? So how is everything? Okay? How's work?
Yeah, it was okay.
Okay. Well, see you in the morning. Hi, my name is Tanya Kay. I am 5'7". I am located in both Vancouver, British Columbia and Los Angeles, California.
Cool. Wow, these are fun to watch. Thanks so much for submitting these. So some very quick things in here. As you saw, there were, even in these 4 submissions, there were lots of different ways of telling this same story. some where we're already sitting, some where we're standing. Something I would have had liked to seen explored in all of these is the actual physical entrance of catching the open door, seeing the friend there being preoccupied, and then dealing with that. This is a wonderful thing where, while it isn't given much mention in the script itself, it is a story moment of showing the opportunity for the character to actually engage in the conversation and see what's going on. So that's a wonderful moment that, I mean, honestly, a lot of people tend to skip the moments that happen right at the beginning, which is why I said it earlier. I love to have the opportunity to experience where we are, what we're dealing with before the scene technically starts and after it ends. And that also includes with committing to our exits. And like, if we're going to leave, believe it when you leave and go for it, because the camera will capture if you have that bit of a, oh, I'm just fake leaving or doubt or whatever it is. We also saw an example in here of if we shoot in portrait and it gets compressed and squeezed outwards, we can get a wider image. And I mean, honestly, like these are having the story come across. So I'm pretty happy with it. It's just the portrait one did get stretched, which is unfortunate, but once again, not the end of the world. The other things I would play around with is I put a lot of actions in this scene, and I also almost made it a side-by-side, almost. So I would have liked to have seen those explored a bit too, which is having the escapes. We had some people explore them. Some could have had it more. Still happy with where it was. Once again, so happy you submitted. Thank you. But also those moments in between actions, as many of us, it can be easy for us to forget. Actions can be as important, if not more important, than dialogue. So whenever they're in the script, see if we really can have some sort of discovery that's going on with that. And we have a couple of actions in there about receiving an item, looking at items. I think I put one on the floor. I think I put one on the bed just for different eye lines. Do we need to appreciate all these eye lines? No, we don't have to. But exploring them to see if it can create new discoveries is what I'm encouraging. For slates, I still recommend separate files, and at least for film and TV, we don't need to say things like end scene or whatever. Hard cuts are perfectly fine if you're comfortable with editing. And if you're not comfortable with editing, see if you can just record separate files themselves and send them out unless otherwise specified.
If you're not asked for a slate, should you do one?
If you do not know the casting director, I would do a slate every time. If you feel like you are not usually seen by them, it's a good way to remind them that a little bit of your personality, I would say. The very last note. This is one I usually address in my workshops as well, and I call people out on it when I see it. Is your shoulders. Your shoulders will be a giveaway to me if you believe you are really dealing with the other person that you are. So talking to your reader, I want to see those shoulders facing the reader and dealing with them. Being in our side-by-side scene where we still have our reader over there, but this is our environment, I want to see the shoulders committing to that. Even with people who work regularly, I still have to remind them to, if they're squared off to the lens, it means to me the other person is not important enough. So I always keep reminding to add in there the importance of dealing with the other person. You got to deal with them. If you are, that means your shoulders are going to be facing them too. It's a very simple, quick trick to remind yourself of looking at, can I see myself clearly? Can I hear myself clearly? Are my shoulders dealing with my environment too? Yeah, I think that's that. We can probably wrap up. It's like 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I want to first thank the very brave, generous people who submitted tape to look at.
Thank you so much again for that. Yes.
And I think that gives us a really great sense of the range of ways of representing the same idea.
Mm-hmm.
And technically they were all quite varied, but
we all had story in there. That's what we
all
want.
had story, all had character, all had people.
Yeah. Someone said I would hire them all. I agree. I would hire them all.
And I want to recognize and acknowledge there are still questions floating here in the Q&A. If folks wanted to pursue these questions and get some answers, where's the best place to go?
So I will be sending a couple of documents. You already have the link to the equipment one. I'll be sending that again with some other ones. I have to put together the pieces of the one about editing and formats for exporting and all of that.
I think that is a recurring
it's
frustration
unfortunately
for everybody. Yeah. I know I rail about the amount of time I spend on that side of things, because
that's the nice thing about using something like VN or DaVinci Resolve. I think Shotcut has this too. I'll have to look into that. You can have fixed export settings. So every single time you want to export for a self-tape, you click the self-tape option essentially, or it was already pre-selected if you're in VN, and then it'll upload exactly as it needs to be.
Do you need to edit?
Trim the beginnings and ends.
That's all that you need to do.
If you don't see story happening, casting directors don't want to see it. That's pretty much it. I know we have like literally 30 seconds left, probably less. I just want to say, as a thank you to everyone who's participating as well, we're giving you one free month for my workshop that I co-run in January as auditing. So we'll give you the information for that.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm going to hand the baton back to Ryan to close up. And thank you. It's been an amazing turnout. The recording will be posted later, so you can refresh your memories and take better notes, because I didn't.
Baton received. Thank you, Deena. Wow, I am seeing in the chats all the thank yous and compliments going by, and they're echoed for me. What an informative session. I learned so much. Alex, I'm prepared to give you 10% of every audition that I book for the coming year to say thank you. In addition to saying thank you to Alex for being here, and thank you to Deena for moderating, big round of applause for our ASL interpreters who have been interpreting the conversation for everybody, even though we speak fast, even though it's all kind of in the moment. They've been doing a great job, so thank you. And thank you, members, for joining us. Have a great rest of the week. Have a great holiday. Have a great winter. And we'll see you at our next session. Thank you so much.